Hello, today I'll be looking to show you how to code Connect 4. We'll look to create a board where we can place pieces in. They'll drop from the top with an animation. If we connect 4 pieces of the same colour together, we'll get a message that says who has won, so in this case red won. Then we can click play again. That will reset the board and we can start placing pieces again. So this version of Connect 4 will be written using just HTML, CSS and JavaScript. We'll be using Visual Studio's code as our IDE and we'll be running the web page in a local browser. In my case, I'm using Chrome. Okay, so let's get coding. We'll start out by creating a new folder on your desktop. I'll call that connect_4. After that, I'm going to open up Visual Studio's code, go to the Explorer tab and click Open Folder. We'll then find our folder that we've just created and open that up. Then within the Explorer tab, we can create a new file within that folder. We'll call that index.html. And then within that index.html file, we need to put some HTML content. Within VS Code, we can just do an exclamation mark and then enter, and it will populate some basic HTML for us. We'll change the title in the head section to Connect 4. And then within the body section, we'll also add a H1 for Connect 4. We can then save that file. After saving that file, we then go to the file in the Connect 4 folder, double click it and open it in your browser. You'll see that we've got the title from the head section as the title in the tab, and then we've got our H1 content shown there. Next, we'll add a background and center some content before we get going with developing the game. So I've downloaded a background image that I found on a website called unsplash.com, which is quite good for getting backgrounds for your own personal projects. So we can just drag that along into our project folder. To use that on our web page, we're going to have to add a styles.css to our project. So I'll create a new file called styles.css. After we create styles.css, I then need to link that to our index.html. So we'll create a link tag in the head section of our index.html. We'll set the href to be our styles.css file, and we'll set the relationship to be style sheet. After that, we'll style the HTML content of our page. So we'll just do HTML, we'll set the background image, we'll do URL, and then within that we'll just point at our background image.jpg. We save and refresh, we can see our background image, but at the moment it won't scale nicely when we change the viewport size. So let's set the background size to be cover. We'll set background repeat to be no repeat. And we'll also set the width and height of the HTML content to be 100%. So our background image should now change nicely when we change the viewport size. Next, let's add some styling to our H1 tag. We'll set the font size to be 5VH. So that'll be 5% of the height of the screen. We can also change the font family, and we'll set it to be the monospace font. Save and refresh. We can see that that's got a little bit larger. If we want to center that, we can go and change our body tag to be of display type flex. Set the flex direction to be column and the align items to be center. Save and refresh, and that moves into the center. Finally, we can set a new color for our H1. We'll just set it to dark blue for now. By default, browsers will set sensible margins around our content. So for example, H1 tags and paragraphs will have a set amount of margin around them so that they lay out nicely if you just put some basic content on the page, but we're going to want to override that for our project. So we're going to go up to set a wildcard up here, and within that, we're going to want to override margin to be 0 for everything, also 0 for all padding. So if we save and refresh that, we can see that there's no longer any sensible margin around our title. It's kind of squished up at the top. So we're going to want to override that and set our own margin to be 2.5 VH. Save and refresh, and that will move that down slightly. We'll also want that to apply for any pseudo elements on the page as well. So we can do wildcard after and wildcard before. Now that we've got our title and our background, we can start thinking about implementing our game. So let's go back to index.html, and beneath our h1 tag, we're going to want to add in a new div for our game board. This is a div and it's got an ID of board. In our styles.css, we'll add some styling for that. So we use the hash to identify the div with the ID of board. Give a width of 70 vmin. So that'll be 70% of either the width or the height, depending on which is smaller. For height, we'll do 60 vmin. And then we'll give it a background color just so that we can see it for now. We'll set that to grey and refresh that, and we can see our board in the center of the web page. Just reduce the opacity on that for now. We're going to want our board to be a grid which has got 7 columns and 6 rows. So to do that, we'll set the display to be of type grid. We'll set the grid template columns to be repeat 7 1fr. So each column is going to try and take up as much room as possible, and there's going to be 7 of them, so we should get 7 evenly spaced columns. We'll want to do similar for rows. So change that columns to rows, and then we're just going to have 6 rows rather than 7. I'll save that and refresh the page. For now, we don't see any visual change, but we can inspect that grid now, and we can see the number of rows and columns that we've got. So you can see that we've got 7 columns and 6 rows. What we're going to want to do is add enough divs to fill in this grid. So because there's 7 columns and 6 rows, that should be 42 divs that we need to add. We could do that in the HTML by adding in 42 divs here. However, it's going to be neater if we do this in JavaScript, and we're also going to need JavaScript anyway to implement the game code. So we'll delete those for now, and we'll add in a JavaScript script that will run from our index.html page. So we'll give it a script tag. We'll set the source to be main.js, and after we've done that, we need to create a main.js file in our project folder. So our index.html will now lay out our h1 and board div, and then run our main.js script. First thing we want to do within our main.js script is grab hold of this board element. So we can do that by doing document.querySelector. Then we'll just do hash board, and we'll say that const board is equal to that. So this board constant is now the board element from the DOM. Next, we want to create and add 42 divs into the board element. So we'll do a for loop. We'll do that from I equals 0 whilst I is less than 42. And for each iteration through the for loop, we'll do document.createElement. We'll create a div. We'll give the div a class name of cell, and then we'll append the div to the board. If we save and then refresh that to run that code, again we can't see anything yet, but if we inspect the board element, we can see that there's now lots of divs in there. So you can see our board div now actually contains 42 cells within it. To make that a little bit clearer, let's add some styling to our cells. So because it's a class name, we do dot and then cell. And we'll just give them all a border of 1 pixel, dotted and white. Save and refresh that, and we can now see all of our divs in our board. So the first thing we want to be able to do is to be able to drop pieces into our board. If we look at that in our end product, we can see that what I'm doing is whenever I hover over a different column, I'm updating where the piece hovers over the entire board. And then when I click on a column, the piece drops down to the bottom of that column. To implement that, what I'm doing is adding listeners onto every single div in the board. And then when my mouse enters into a different div, it will trigger this piece up here to update. We can calculate which column I'm hovered over based on the index of the div that I'm hovering over, that my mouse enters. So let's take a look at what that looks like when it's coded up. So within the for loop that we created before for creating the divs, we can also use that to add a onMouse enter function. So this will trigger whenever we enter our mouse on top of one of these divs. So we've got 42 cells within the board. If my mouse goes into one of those cells, it will trigger this function. And for now, let's just console log out the I value from the for loop. So if I save that, open up the web tools. So if you don't know how to get to those, you can go to more tools and developer tools, or you can just use the shortcut. And now if I refresh this page and hover over one of these divs, you will see that 0 is printed out, next one is 1. If I go down a row, that's an 8. Go down another row, it's a 15. So if we actually wanted to see what that looked like for all the different rows, I've got another grid that I've created in a different project that will show what that would look like. So the indexes increment as they go across rows first, and then once we get to the end of a row, it will move on to the next one. So the thing we want to know when we end up hovering over one of these divs is what column we're hovered over. So if we hover over the div at 38, we want to know that we're in this column here. And the way that we'd do that is to take the mod 7 of that index. So all of the indexes in the first column are multiples of 7. So if we divide any of these numbers by 7, the remainder is going to be 0. For the second column, if we take the mod of 7 for each of these numbers, it will be 1. So if we took 7, removed a 7 from it, we'd be left with 1. If we took 15 and removed as many 7s as we could, and then we'd be left with 1 after that. And if we did likewise for 22, we'd remove 21, we'd be left with 1. Same for 29, same with 36. And then for the next column over, it'd be the same story, but we would be left with 2. Same for the next column over and the next column over. So to see that in action, I'm just going to update my console log now to be imod7. If we save that, so if I refresh the page, bring up the console log. Now when I hover over these, rather than getting the index, I'll get the column number. So next I'll implement it so that when I hover over a different column, we actually add a piece at the top of the appropriate column that we can see. And when we move to a different column, we remove the old piece position and place in a new piece position. Before I go any further, I'm just going to update the div variable in this for loop to be cell for each of these. That's just purely to make things more readable. Where we were console logging out the column number, instead I'm going to call a function. We'll call the function on mouse entered column, and we'll pass in imod7, and we'll write the new function below. Within that function, we'll get the appropriate cell for the top of the grid. So regardless of if I'm hovering near the bottom of the grid, or the middle, or the top, I also want the cell at the top of the board for that column. But to get that, we can do board.children. And then I can just put the column in square brackets, and that will give me the appropriate cell. In that cell, which is itself a div, I'm going to place in another div. But this div I'll call piece. I'll give it a class name of piece. I'm also going to give the piece a data set of whether or not it's placed or not, and I'm going to set that to be false. So later on, when we actually place pieces, when we click on the group board and pieces fall to the bottom, they will have a placed value of true. but for now this one's going to have a placed value of false. Then let's append that piece to the cell. So let's save that. Let's add some styling so that we'll be able to see the piece. So we'll give the piece a border radius of 50%, so it ends up being a circle. We'll also give it a background colour, and for now we'll just make them all red. So before this shows up on our grid, we're also going to have to make the parent div around the piece. So the cell that we have a display type of flex, and we'll give our piece a flex scroll of 1. We refresh that, and then we hover over a column, we see a piece appear. If we go to the next column, another piece, and you can see that at the moment we're adding pieces, but we're never removing them. So we're getting this strange behavior that every time we hover over a different column, a new piece gets added into the top div or the top cell. So to solve this strange behavior, we're going to have to remove the cells as we add a new one. So let's go back to our main.js. And before we add a piece, we need to remove any existing piece. So we can do document.querySelector, and we only have a plan for there to be one placed piece at a time. So we just need to find that. So because we did the data set of placed equals false, we can search for that using our query selector. So we'll do a query selector looking for a unplaced piece. This might return null, so we need to guard against that. If it's not null, if this is actually an element from our DOM, we need to remove it. So we'll get the parent element, do remove child, and it's just going to remove itself. We save and refresh that. We should now be able to move between the columns, and we only ever have one placed piece at the top. You'll notice in the example that I'm looking at here that that piece is actually hovering above the board rather than along the top row. So we can do similar. In our styles.css, we'll give the board some padding at the top. This will be 10 vmin. So if we refresh and see that, we can see that there's now some padding above our board. And then we can do a selector in our CSS for any element with class name piece that has a data set of data placed equals false. And we'll just transform it to have a translate y of -10 vmin. What that will do is that if our piece has got the data set placed set to a value of false, it will move our piece up by 10 vmin. So let's refresh that. And we can see that our piece is now floating above the top row. At this point, I might remove the background color, save that and refresh. And we get it looking like this. We might want to change this red color to better stand out against the different backgrounds here. So I make that a little bit more of a pinky color so it stands out against those kind of orange-red balloons. Okay, so now we can hover over columns. What we want to be able to do next is be able to click on a column and have a piece drop down into it. So the way we want that to work is that as we fill up columns, those pieces drop on top of each other. If we completely fill a column, we should no longer be able to drop pieces on top of that column. So the first thing we need to be able to do is detect when the user actually clicks on that column, and we'll do that in a similar way to the on-mouse enter, but instead of setting the on-mouse enter function, we'll set the on-click function. Again, we'll use an arrow function, and within the arrow function, we'll just pass it off to another function that we write in our file. It'll be on column clicked. We'll again take the column number, and again that column number will just come from the index mod 7. So if we click on this first column, that column number will be 0. If we click on the last one, it will be 6. If we want to be able to figure out whether or not we can actually drop pieces into a given column, we need some way of representing what pieces already exist on the board within our code. So to do that, we'll write a new constant at the top. We'll call it pieces. And the way I'm going to do it is to have an array of numbers, and each number is going to represent whether or not a piece is in each cell in the board. So we'll have an array with 42 numbers in it. To start with, all those numbers will be zeros. So those first 7 will represent the top row, and then we'll need 6 more rows represented. That should be 42 in total. And the way that will represent whether or not a cell is empty, has got a red piece in it or a yellow piece, is by changing the numbers. So we'll say that 0 is empty, 1 represents a red piece, and 2 represents a yellow piece. So if we wanted to represent what is currently on that board, that would be a 1 in this position, a 2 there, a 1 there, and a 2 there. And then if we placed a piece down here, what we would want is for this to update to be a 1 there. And again, we'd also want to add the appropriate piece into the appropriate div down here, and also animate it. So we'll come to that in a bit. So let's just reset that to be all zeros for now, because that will be our starting state. When we come to place a piece in a column, the first thing we want to know is how many pieces already exist in that column. And the way we're going to do that is to filter this pieces array for only the indexes that match the column number. So by that, I mean if our column is the third column across, so a column index of 2, say, we only want the indexes that match that. So we only want the indexes of 2, 9, 16, 23, 30, and 37. So we're going to take pieces and we're going to filter it. And we don't actually care about the number in the index at the moment, so we don't care about the element, but we do care about the index. And we're going to say that if the index mod 7 is equal to our column, then that's going to represent all of the indexes in the column that we are interested in. So that's going to represent all of the pieces in the column that we're interested in, and then we just want the last index of a 0 for that, and that's going to give us our first available row. So with a completely empty grid, we would filter this down, we would end up with just 6 values in it, and therefore the last index of 0 is going to be 5, which is kind of our row index. We'll check if the available row is a positive number. So for example, if we actually had numbers in all of these, so it was 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, and 2. So that would represent something that looked like this. So if that was the case, we wouldn't be able to find any index of 0 in that column. And this last index of would return -1. So if available rows equals -1, we know that there's no space in that column. And then we're just going to return straight away. So our function won't do anything if that column is full. If that column is not full, so we had something that looked like a red, a yellow, a red, a yellow, and we're about to place another piece on top of it. So in that case, pieces would look a bit like this. We'd have a 1 down here, a 2 there, a 1 and a 2. Our filter would have just created a new array with these values in it from this column. And the last index of 0 for that would have been at the 1 position, so row index of 1, which again, as we went through before, would have been this row here. So at that point, we are going to want to get that value and we are going to want to change it. And we're basically going to want to change it to the appropriate color. So if it's red player's turn, it will be a 1. And if it's a yellow player's turn, it will change to a 2. For now, because we're always just hovering with a red piece, we'll always just change it to a 1. And we'll deal with switching player turns shortly. So we'll do pieces. We'll get the index of the available row multiplied by 7 plus the column. So in this case, that would give us this index here. And we'll set that to 1 for now. And in fact, just to prepare for a changing the player turn in future, we'll say let player turn equal 1. So we'll switch this between 1 and 2 in future. And then in our code down here, we can just set that to be the same as whoever's turn it is. As well as updating the pieces array here, we're also going to want to update the actual grid itself. So we're going to want to find the appropriate div in our grid and add a piece to it. So to do that, we will do board.children. We'll use the exact same calculation to get the appropriate child of the board for what will represent our new piece. Here we need to create a new piece. So we're going to do very similar to how we created a new piece in our mouse entered. The difference is that we're going to set the placed to be true rather than false. And again, we're going to add it to the cell that is first available rather than the one at the top of the grid. If we save and refresh this now, we should be able to actually drop pieces into place. So that was working a little bit funny there because I didn't start with an empty grid here. So, okay, so we can completely fill columns with red pieces at the moment. We do see some funny behavior when we completely fill a column, but we'll come back to that later. The next thing we'll do is introduce the ability to switch between red and yellow pieces. So we'll add a couple of constants at the top for red turn and yellow turn. This should just make our code a little bit more readable. Now we can kind of alternate player turn based on if it's currently set to red turn or yellow turn. So after we've added our piece, if its player turn equals red turn, we will set it to be yellow turn. Else it can be set to red turn. The other thing we need to do is when we are placing a piece, we need to set whether or not it should be a red or yellow piece. So we'll just give that element of a piece kind of a data set of the player's turn. We'll do something down here as well. Now in our styles.css, rather than setting the piece background color, we'll set the background color for a piece based on its data set of player. So if the player is 1, that is the red player, and we'll set the background color to be this reddish color. And if the piece is 2, that will represent a yellow player. And again, we can just change this background color to be yellow. So now when we refresh our page, our pieces actually change color appropriately. There's a few things that we need to fix at this point now. So when we first place a piece, so when I click here, the piece at the top doesn't change until I actually hover over at a different cell. So I place a yellow piece, it stays yellow at the top until I change which cell I'm hovering over. Also, if I completely fill a column, then we get this kind of weird behavior of divs kind of sharing that top column. So what's happening there is that the unplaced cell is being placed into here, then moved up those 10 vmins. So that's why it's kind of jumping and pushing over the the piece that's already placed in that column. So we'll look at solving both of those next. So after we've placed a new piece in a column, we need to update the color of the unplaced piece hovering at the top of the column. And we also need to consider that that column might now be full as well. So I'm actually going to write a new function to deal with that. So this update hover function is going to pretty much do what we were already doing in on mouse entered column. But this column number we're just going to actually store at the top. So we'll store the equals, start that out as -1. So this will just basically store whatever column we last hovered over. We'll have our on mouse entered column basically just update that. Let's rename that to hover column, just so it's a little bit easier to understand. And then in our update column, we can make use of that variable. So let's refresh that and see if that fixes our problems. So I also need to remember to actually call that update hover in our on mouse entered. So on our mouse entered column, we update the hover column itself to be the column that the mouse entered, and then we call our update hover function. So let's refresh that. So we're still able to hover between different columns. And then when we place pieces, the piece at the top automatically changes from red to yellow, then yellow to red. We still have our issue of the hover thing acting in a weird way for full columns. So what we need to do is, before we add our hover piece, we need to check if the column is already full. And we can easily do that just to check if pieces of the hover column is 0, then we're safe to kind of place that unplaced piece. So this basically checks when we're hovering over a column, is this top value 0 or not? Save and refresh. And then if we fill up a column, you can see now that we can no longer hover over a filled column, and the unplaced piece just disappears. Okay, the next thing we want to be able to do is animate our pieces when we drop them into our board. To be able to animate our pieces down, we need to know the difference in height between the placed piece up here and the piece that we're about to place into the bottom of the board. We can then set up a translate Y animation between the two. So to get the Y coordinate of the unplaced piece, we need to grab hold of the unplaced piece first. We then need to call a function called get bounding client rect. This will give us the bounding rectangle for where our unplaced piece is on the screen. And we just want the Y value for that. Save that as unplaced Y for now. And then we want to do similar for our piece that we are just adding to our board. We'll call that placed Y. We'll just call the difference between the two Y diff, and that'll just be the unplaced Y minus the placed Y. So that's the number of pixels that we want to animate from the top down to the bottom. And we need to animate the piece that we have just added. So we're going to do piece.animate. This is going to take in a few arguments. So the first thing is going to be an array of keyframes. And then after that, it's going to be an object describing a few of the properties of the animation, such as the duration. So we can have that as 400. The easing we'll set to be linear. The iteration, so how many times the animation repeats itself, will just be set to 1. After that, we want the keyframes. So this is going to be an array of objects, and each object is going to describe states that the piece is in during that frame of the animation. So we're just going to be dealing with transforms, and each transform is going to be of the kind translate Y. and that's going to take in the number of pixels we want to translate it by. And then we also need to provide where that keyframe is in the animation. So if the offset is 0, that's at the very start of the animation. And then we'll do a very similar one for at the end of the animation. But that will have translate y pixels of 0. So it'll end up in the exact same place that we actually originally placed it. So if we save and refresh that, we can now see that we actually animate our pieces down into the positions that they are going for. If you can see the one that I've done here, you can see that the pieces actually have a slight bounce at the bottom. I've done that by adding a few more kind of keyframes into the animation. And they're all just based off the Y difference as well. Okay, so after playing around with the animation for a bit, I'm just going to leave it with these 4 keyframes. Okay, so we can now drop pieces into place and build up our grid. The next thing we need to do is make it so that when we actually connect 4 in a row, the game ends, or if we completely fill the grid up, that should also end the game. So after this animation ends, we need to do a check of the game state to see if the player whose turn it's been has just won the game or not. To do that, we're going to actually set this animation to be a variable, and then we can add a listener for when that animation completes. So when the animation finishes, it will then run this function. So we'll do that as an arrow function for now. But it's just going to end up calling a function that we would write down here. So we'll create a new function down here called check game win or draw, and I'll actually just replace that function there and call it straight off there. We'll actually move our switching the player's turn logic down here. The other thing I want to do is stop additional pieces being dropped into our grid whilst the animation is happening, and also to remove this top piece whilst the animation is happening. So I'll add a little bit of code to cover that. We'll just have another variable up here called animating. Set that to be initially false. We'll block any clicks if we are animating. We'll set animating to be true at this point. And we'll set animating to be false as soon as we complete our animation. We'll also update our update hover function and split these into 2 separate functions because we want to remove our unplaced piece whilst the animation is happening. So we can just move that down to there and then call that function within this update hover. Let's refresh that, and something is broken. Okay, so this if check needs to be if not animating. So we're allowing the user to click whenever we're not animating a piece. Save and refresh that. Okay, so it looks like things are working as they were before. What we want is this piece to disappear whilst the animation happens. So I need to call that remove unplaced piece at this point here. Let's refresh. So we click on the column, it drops the piece down, and then the new hover piece only appears after the animation for the existing piece has finished. Okay, so we now have a good place to write our logic for what should happen if a player is actually about to win. So in this case, in our full game, what we want to happen is if the player wins, we want to show a modal, and we want the user to be able to click play again to refresh the page. To do that, we're going to want to be able to run through our pieces at the end of a piece dropping down to the bottom and check if a player has actually won the game. So for example, if I'm red and I manage to get 4 red pieces next to each other in a horizontal line like that, then I should win the game. It should show that modal. So in our function for check game win or draw, before we kind of change the player turn back to being the next person's turn, we actually need to check if the game's over in here. And we only want to actually change the player turn and update the hover position again if the game is still being played. So we can split this into two sections actually. So we can first check if the game is a draw, because that's the easier to check, and then after that we can check if the current player has won. To check if the game is a draw, all we really need to do is check if any of these numbers are still zeros. So if the game is completely filled up, so if the board's completely filled up and it's a draw, then there'll be no values in the pieces array that are 0. So if we used array includes 0, that will give us back what we want to know straight away. So we can simply do if pieces dot includes 0. We can then negate that. So if pieces does not include 0, game is a draw. And for now, we can just put up a confirm. And then once the player has confirmed that they've seen that message, we can do location.reload. So let's refresh that and try that out. We just need to fill up the grid. Okay, so this last piece should fill up our grid and we should get a confirm dialog. There we go. So we get a confirm dialog. It says the game is a draw. And when we click OK or cancel, it will refresh the page. We'll change this to a modal later. We'll pass off the checking if the current player has won or not to its own function. So we'll say if player has won. We can pass in the player's turn, and we can pass in the pieces array. And if that is the case, we would say current player has won, and we'd do a confirm for that. And then our message could take in, could print out whether or not it's the red or yellow player who has won. Okay, so we're going to need to write this function. If this function returns true, then we're going to end up with this confirm dialog popping up. And it's basically going to say either red won or yellow won based on whose turn it is. And then it will reload the page once the user clicks OK or cancel. Okay, so we've got this function that needs to return true or false based on if the current player has won or not. To implement this, I'm actually just going to move this to the top to be next to the relevant array, so this pieces array. Hopefully that will make it easier to explain. If the current player turn is red turn and the pieces array looks like this function should return true because it should find the fact that you've got 4 red pieces connected on the bottom row here. Equally, it should do similar for kind of vertical wins as well. So if we have 4 pieces vertically kind of stacked on top of each other, it should detect that that's a win as well. And it will be based on whoever's just placed a piece. It also needs to deal with the diagonals as well. So in this case, when red places a piece here, we need to detect that there's this diagonal going from left to right, bottom to top. And we also need to cover the other diagonal as well. So right to left from bottom to top also needs to be coming out as true. The way we're going to approach this is to write a for loop. And it's going to go from 0 to 41. So the index will start at 0, and whilst it's less than 42, we keep incrementing the index. And what we want to do for each of these indexes, so these indexes are going to correspond to these values here, is to basically check, is this index the start of a horizontal win, a vertical win, or a win in the left to right, bottom to top diagonal, or a win in the right to the left, bottom to top diagonal. And so we keep looping through the array until we get to the end. And if any of them actually match our logic, then we know that the player has won. So let's write those things out in comments. Okay, so let's deal with the simplest case first, which is probably the horizontal win condition. To check this for current index, we need to be aware that there's only certain indexes on the board where this could be true for. So for example, if we're starting at our index of 19, the next four values along are 20, 21, and 22, but they actually go onto the next row of the board. Therefore, there's no point in us actually checking for a horizontal win starting at index 19. In fact, it only makes sense for us to check the horizontal wins for elements that start in these first four columns. Anything outside of these first four columns, if we try and count the next three indexes along, we're going to end up on a new line, or even possibly out of bounds for ones at the end. So let's write a for loop just to check that we're only covering the indexes that are in the first four columns. So to do that, we'll say if index mod 7 is less than 4, then we can perform our check. So to do that, we do if pieces and then the index is equal to player turn, and we're then going to do the same for index plus 1 and 2 and 3. So if all these are the same as the current player's turn, we should return true. So if player turn was equal to 1 for red, and we ended up having all ones along here, when index got to 35, we would check, does the 35th element in the pieces array equal 1? It does. Does the 36th? It does. Does the 37th? It does. And does the 38th? It does. And then we would end up hitting this return true. If none of them, if we never hit a statement that returns true, we should just return false at the end. And finally, because this is a nested if statement that is just all interconnected with ands, we can actually move this logic up and just have a single if statement for this horizontal check. So if the current index we're checking is in the first four columns, and the current index matches the player turn, and so do the three elements next to it, then we can return true. So this will match any of these scenarios that we have here. Okay, so let's test that out. All right, so now when we paste this, we should get a dialog, and red has won. That's great. We can test things out for yellow as well. There we go, yellow can win as well. I've just noticed a slight bug that if we start animating and dropping the thing down and then move our cursor over, we get the wrong coloured thing showing up. So to fix that, I'm just going to put a if not animating around this. Okay, cool. So now, whilst our pieces are animating down, we don't actually see a piece appearing at the top, even if we move our cursor around. Okay, so next we want to be able to detect vertical wins. We're going to do something very similar, but let's have a look at how we'll do that with the indexes on our grid. So when we detect vertical wins, rather than detecting the three cells next to our target index, we're going to detect the three cells underneath it. So you see that in this case, rather than the numbers going from 0, 1, 2, and 3, they go from 0, 7, 14, and 21. So then if we started at 18, we'd be adding 7 each time. Also, because we're checking the 3 pieces below our current piece, it won't be possible for any item in the bottom 3 rows to be the start of a vertical win. Wins in the vertical direction can only be started in the top 3 rows. Anything outside this highlighted area can't be the start of a vertical win. So we can pretty much write very similar logic to what we had before, except our index check is going to be to make sure that our index value starts below 21. So as long as index is less than 21, and index is the same as player turn, and then rather than jumping by 1, we're going to jump by 7s. So we're going to check the index plus 7, and index plus 14, index plus 21. So let's refresh our page and see if that works. Cool, that's working as expected. Okay, so let's just check that with the vertical winning position starting at the very first column. So this should now win for yellow. You can see that shows yellow has won. Okay, now that we've done the horizontal and the vertical, the next things to do are the diagonals. So the first one I'm going to check is the diagonals going in this direction here. So again, we just need to figure out how large a change we're making to our checked elements each time. So we can see if we start at a 0 up here, we're then increasing by 8 to check the diagonal in this direction. And we can also just, if we draw this in here, we can now quite easily kind of deduce that this can only work for indexes that start in this box here. Anything outside of this box wouldn't have enough room to fit a diagonal in that direction. Again, that one would go out of bounds. So we'll write some very similar code, but this time we're going to check both that it's in the first 4 columns. So we can just take that from there, and that the index is also less than 18. And then rather than incrementing by 7, we'll increment by 8 each time. Save and try that out. Okay, so this should pick up that diagonal. There we go, red has won. And we can do similar on this edge as well. Okay, and finally we just need to check the other diagonal. So index mod 7 should be greater than or equal than 3 to get these last 4 columns, and index should be less than 21. So if we refresh that page now, we can then try out winning in that direction. Okay, so that completes our logic for has player won. Okay, we now have a functional connect for game. The rest of this video is just going to be improving the styling. We can see in this version of the game, our pieces actually end up going behind the board. So the board is a load of circles with a transparent section cut out, and all those circles go on top of the pieces, and the pieces animate behind it. So the way I ended up implementing that was to use pseudo elements. So if we go to our styles.css, so for example, if I do background image for each of these things, and I'll set that to be a different color rather than the one on the other project. I'll save that and refresh. You can see that we get ourselves with this blue color, but when we drop our pieces in, they go over the top of it, which isn't really how a kind of connect for board looks when you're playing. The pieces go inside of the circles. So we want our background image to actually kind of go in front of the content of the div that the pieces are falling into. And rather than this background going as a background image on this cell, what I actually want to do is give this cell a pseudo element. So you can do before or after here. I'm going to make the cell itself be a position of relative, and then I can set the pseudo element to be a position of absolute. We need to set the content of the pseudo element to be something, in this case just an empty string, otherwise it won't appear at all. We can then set the width and the height to be 100%. We can now move our background image from being on the cell itself to being on the pseudo element for the cell. So if we refresh that and drop some pieces in, we can see that whilst it's animating down, the pieces are in front of the background, but once the animation is completed, they fall behind it. So again, this isn't quite what we want. What we need to do is say that our Z index for this is going to be 1, so that it's always drawn on top of our pieces. So again, just to go over how that's been done, we set the position on the cell itself to be a position of relative. The pseudo element of before inside of cell is within that cell, and therefore its position, therefore its absolute position is going to be relative to the position of the cell. We set the content to be an empty string so that it actually displays the background image for us. We set the width and the height to be 100% so it matches the size of the cell. Then finally we set the Z index to be 1 so that even during the animation the pieces appear behind the background image here. And then I think the final thing that I probably didn't go into any detail there is that the reason that we've got a transparent circle in the middle of our blue background is this radial gradient. So we set the center of the gradient to be transparent, and then we set it to become, and that goes up until 60%, and then we set it to be the blue color from 60% to 100%. So we get a transparent circle on the inside of this background, and then a solid blue circle on the outside. Okay, so the final thing I think I need to cover is the modals. So when the game ends, we want to display a modal where we can click a button to restart the game. So to add in more content to the modals, we need to add a bit more content into our index.html. So we'll need a div for the modal background. We'll call it modal container. Within the modal container, we'll have another div for modal content. And within that, we'll have our kind of title of game over. We'll have a bit of a paragraph of text to explain whether or not it's a draw or a win. And that's going to have an ID as well. And then we need a button that we can click to reset the page. So let's go into styles and start adding some content for that. Okay, so we're going to want to set the CSS for the modal container. So at the end, the modal container is going to be the thing that does this black background behind the actual modal content. So we'll just set modal container. Initially, it will have a display of none because it won't appear initially. But for now, just so that we can see what the rest of the modal content looks like, we'll set that to block, and we'll set that back to none before we actually run the code. The position is going to be fixed. Then we'll just set the top to be 0, left to be 0, because we essentially want it to cover the entire screen, width starting from the top left to the very bottom. We'll set the Z index to 1 so that the modal will always appear over the top of other things. We'll set a background color. So we don't want solid black, we want it to be kind of maybe 50% opacity. And then we can set some padding at the top so that the modal content is pushed down slightly when it does display, maybe 15% of the vertical height. Okay, so if I go on here and refresh that now, we can see that we've kind of got our black background. And again, this will initially be set to none. So it would initially not be visible at all. And then when we set this display to be block rather than none, it will jump in and we'll be able to see the content within the modal container. Next, we want to style the actual modal container, which is what contains these divs here. Next, we want to style the modal content, which is what contains the h1 tag, the paragraph, and then the button. We'll give that a background color of some form of grey-white for now. So we'll give it a width of 80VW, so 80% of the entire view width. Set the margins to be auto, so it kind of centers in the middle. We want our content to be centered horizontally, so we'll set it to be a display type of flex direction of column, and align item center. Next, I'm just going to move our font family up to apply to everything. So I'm only ever going to use one font family, and I want it to apply to all the H1 and paragraphs and buttons that we have. So I just moved it up to apply to everything. We can then add some styling for our reset button. So again, I've just copied that over from my other project. Again, this reset button is within our modal content. And then we also have paragraph text set in the middle. So I'll just do something like the game is a draw. You can see that that's looking maybe a little bit small there. So we'll just give that modal message a bit of a font size on the margin. Refresh that, and that looks a little bit better. Okay, so now we can set that back to be none, so it doesn't display when we first see it. And now we can programmatically trigger and change what is displayed for those things in our JavaScript code. So we're going to have the modal container, and then we'll do similar for our modal message and our reset button. So at the top, we can just quickly set the action for if anyone ever clicks our reset button. That's just going to be location.reload. So that will be the same as if the user just refreshed the page. So it will result in the game restarting. We're going to move this hasPlayer1 function back down. Maybe that can just live at the bottom, really. And then in our code where we have hasPlayer1, if it's true, or if it's a draw, let's cover the maybe draw scenario first. Modal container dot style display, and we'll set that back to be block rather than the none that it is set to. We also want our modal message, and we want to set the text content to that to be draw. So let's test that out. So I'm just going to fill up the entire screen. Okay, so I filled up the board, so we're about to get into a draw. You can see that we get the modal being displayed, we get the message draw being shown. We can't click anywhere else on the screen, and we can only click play again. We'll now do similar for the win message. So again, we're just going to update the win dialog now. So if I refresh this, I win as red. You can see we get our message red has won, and we can play again. What might be nice is if we change the color of our win message to match who had won. And the final thing we could maybe do is animate in this content box here, so it looks a little bit nicer. So we'll give it an animation name and a duration, then we'll just set some keyframes for how our modal content should animate in. Okay, so just testing that out, and it looks like we also need to add in a position relative if we want it to animate in from the top. Okay, so that's the Connect 4 game complete. Hopefully you found that useful. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like or a comment to let me know. It's much appreciated, and I hope you have a good day.